Some men only understand peace after they've learned what violence really costs. The restroom is empty when he walks in. Quiet. Just boots on marble tile. He loosens his collar and turns toward the mirror. Then the door swings open. Two men step inside. Big men. One blocks the exit. The other moves closer. Too close. They don't know who they've cornered. The man at the mirror is Steven Seagal. It's 1989. Above the law just made him Hollywood's most dangerous leading man. And he didn't learn those moves on a soundstage. He learned them in dojos across Japan under masters who never cared about fame. These two men think they see an actor, a celebrity caught off guard. What does a real 7th-degree black belt do when two strangers trap him in a locked room? If you're new here, subscribe and follow for stories you won't hear anywhere else. Now let me take you back about 45 minutes. Before the restroom, before the two men, before any of it. The party was at one of those private clubs on Sunset Boulevard that doesn't have a sign out front. You don't find it. You get invited. And tonight the place was full. Studio people, producers, directors still wearing sunglasses indoors because they thought it made them look important. The music was low. The champagne was expensive. And somewhere in the middle of all of it stood Steven Seagal. He was the guest of honor. Well, one of them. The rap party was for a film he'd just finished, and the studio was already talking sequel numbers. Above the Law had done something nobody expected. It made real money, and the man who made it happen was standing by the bar in a dark suit, holding a glass of water. Not champagne. Water. That tells you something right there. Now here's the thing about Seagal that most people at that party didn't understand. They saw the movie star. They saw the tall guy with the slicked-back hair who threw people through windows on screen. What they didn't see was the 15 years he spent in Japan before anyone in Hollywood knew his name. 15 years. Think about that. While other actors were doing auditions and waiting tables, Steven Seagal was living in Osaka, training under Aikido masters who would have laughed at the idea of making a movie. He didn't just study the art. He ran a dojo, his own school. And here's the part that matters. He was the first foreigner to ever operate an Aikido dojo in Japan. Not the first American. The first non-Japanese person. Period. That doesn't happen because you're talented. That happens because the people who invented the art looked at you and said, "This man is serious." But nobody at that party cared about any of that. To them, he was a new action star. Product. Something the studio could sell. And Seagal knew it. He'd been in rooms like this before. Not in Hollywood. In Japan. Where powerful men sat across from you and smiled while deciding whether you were useful or disposable. The suits were different. The language was different. But the game was the same. He noticed things that night. Small things. A man by the far wall who wasn't drinking and wasn't talking to anyone. A second man near the hallway entrance who kept checking his watch. Seagal filed it away. He didn't react. He just noticed. Two executives had been talking to him for the last 20 minutes. Smiling. Laughing. Pitching him on a 3-picture deal. Seagal was polite. He nodded. He listened. But if you watched his eyes, you'd notice something. He wasn't looking at them. He was scanning the room. Old habit. The kind of habit you pick up when you've spent years in places where awareness isn't optional. He excused himself. Said he needed a moment. Walked down the hallway toward the restroom. That long, quiet hallway with the gold-framed mirrors on the walls and the marble floor that made every footstep echo. And that's where we came in. The restroom. The two men. The locked door. Now let me tell you what happened next. Because this is where the evening stopped being a party. The bigger of the two men, the one blocking the door, he spoke first. His voice was calm, almost friendly. He said something like, "Mr. Seagal, someone wants to have a word with you about your future." Seagal didn't respond. He turned from the mirror. Slowly. Not because he was scared. Because he was reading the room. Reading their weight distribution. Their stance. Whether their hands were open or closed. That's not something you learn in acting class. That's something drilled into you after 10,000 hours on a mat. The second man, the one who had moved too close, he smiled. He said, "You're a big guy on screen. Let's see how big you are in here. Now get this. Most men in that situation would have done one of two things. They would have shouted for help, or they would have thrown a punch out of fear. Seagal did neither. He lowered his hands to his sides, open palms, relaxed shoulders. If you've never trained in Aikido, that posture means nothing to you. But if you have, you know exactly what it means. It means the man standing in front of you is ready. Not tense, not angry, ready. And there is a very big difference. And that's when Seagal asked a question. Just one. Quiet. Almost gentle. Did he tell you what I did before movies? Neither man answered. They just looked at each other. And in that silence, in that small marble room with the gold mirrors and the locked door, the balance shifted. Not because of anything loud. Not because of anything dramatic. But because Steven Seagal asked a question that had no good answer. And both men, for the first time since they walked in, looked uncertain. The room was silent. The door was locked. And the only man in that restroom who knew exactly what was about to happen was the one they came to intimidate. The bigger man moved first. Believe me, it's always the bigger one. He didn't throw a punch. He grabbed, both hands on Seagal's jacket, trying to shove him backward into the wall. That was his mistake. Not because the grab was weak. It wasn't. The man had at least 40 pounds on Seagal. But a grab is an offering in Aikido. You're giving the other person your balance, your momentum, your weight. And Steven Seagal had spent 15 years learning exactly what to do with that gift. He didn't resist the push. He moved with it, redirected the energy sideways. His left hand caught the man's wrist. His right hand found the elbow. And in one smooth motion that took less than a second, the bigger man was airborne. Not dramatically, not like in the movies. He went sideways, hard, into the row of sinks along the wall. His back hit the marble countertop. His elbow cracked against one of the faucet handles. The handle snapped clean off. And suddenly there was water, spraying upward, hitting the mirror, hitting the ceiling, spreading across the floor in a thin, fast sheet. That sound, the hiss of pressurized water and the crack of porcelain. That's the sound that changed the evening. Because up until that moment, this could have ended with words, with posturing, with two men backing down and walking out. But now there was damage, physical evidence, a broken fixture, a man on the floor groaning and holding his ribs. There was no going back from this. The second man saw his partner go down. And here's where most people get the story wrong. They think the second guy charged in out of loyalty or bravery. He didn't. He panicked. He lunged forward because his brain told him that if he didn't do something right now, he was next. And panic is the worst thing you can bring into a fight with someone who is calm. Seagal sidestepped. Just barely. The man's momentum carried him forward and Seagal caught his right wrist on the way past. Now, if you've never seen a proper Aikido wrist lock applied at full speed, let me tell you what it looks like. It doesn't look violent. It looks almost gentle. The wrist turns. The elbow follows. The shoulder has no choice but to rotate. And then the whole body drops. It's physics. Pure physics. But it doesn't feel like physics. It feels like your arm is being unscrewed from your body. The man went down to one knee, then both knees. His wrist was bent at an angle that wrists are not supposed to bend. And there was a sound. A small, tight pop. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a sound that meant something had broken. The man screamed, short and sharp. Then he went quiet, holding his wrist against his chest and breathing through his teeth. The water was still spraying. The floor was soaked. The bigger man was trying to sit up against the base of the sinks. One hand pressed to his ribs, water running down his face. The second man was kneeling in the middle of the floor, cradling his wrist, not looking at anyone. And Seagal was standing exactly where he'd been standing 30 seconds ago. His jacket was wet on one side. There was a small tear near the lapel where the first man had grabbed him. But his breathing was even. His hands were at his sides, open, relaxed, like he'd just finished a conversation about the weather. Now here's what the narrator wants you to understand. This was not a movie sequence. There were no camera angles, no choreography, no stunt coordinator calling out timing. What happened in that restroom took less than 8 seconds from the first grab to the second man hitting the floor. 8 seconds. That's the difference between someone who pretends to fight on screen and someone who learned to fight for real in a country where martial arts are not entertainment. They are culture. They are discipline. They are taken very seriously. Seagal looked at both men. He didn't say anything at first. The water was pooling around his shoes. The mirror behind him was streaked and dripping. Then he spoke. Calm. Measured. Like a teacher correcting a student. Tell whoever sent you that the next conversation won't happen in a restroom. That was it. No threats. No shouting. Just a sentence that carried more weight than anything those two men had heard all night. The bigger man didn't respond. He was focused on breathing. The second man looked up from his broken wrist, and for the first time, his eyes showed something beyond pain. They showed recognition. He finally understood who he'd been sent to intimidate. Seagal stepped over the man on the floor, careful not to slip on the wet tile. He reached the door, turned the lock, pulled it open. The hallway was quiet. The same gold-framed mirrors on the walls. The same marble floor. But now the faint sound of music drifted in from the party. Something smooth. Something with piano. The kind of music that belongs in a room full of champagne and good news. Seagal stepped into the hallway and let the restroom door close behind him. He adjusted his cuffs, straightened the tear in his lapel as best he could, rolled his shoulders once. Then he started walking back toward the party. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like it was over. Like whatever had just happened in that restroom would stay in that restroom. Like the water would be found by a janitor and the two men would pick themselves up and disappear into the night. Like Seagal would walk back to the champagne and the handshakes and the studio executives and no one would ever know. For a moment, the evening felt normal again. Calm. Even pleasant. But that moment was a lie. Because the second Seagal stepped back into the main room, someone noticed. A woman at a corner table. She was holding a champagne flute and looking right at him. Not at his face. At his sleeve. There was blood on his shirt cuff. Not a lot. Just enough to catch the light. And before Seagal could adjust his jacket to cover it, he heard the click. Polaroid camera. One of those party photographers the club hired to float around and capture candid moments. The kind of photos that end up in gossip columns and celebrity magazines. The photographer had snapped a picture of Seagal mid-stride, coming out of the hallway, blood on his cuff, his lapel slightly torn. The flash went off and the image slid out of the camera with that familiar mechanical whir. Now here's where it turns. The woman who noticed the blood leaned over and whispered to the man sitting next to her. And that man was the reason those two were in the restroom in the first place. His name doesn't matter. What matters is what he was. Producer. Not one of the big, famous ones whose names you see on movie posters. The other kind. The kind who works behind the scenes. The kind who makes phone calls. The kind who decides whether your career goes up or goes down, and you never even see it happening. Seagal had refused to work with him 6 months earlier. Turned down a project. Didn't even take the meeting. And in Hollywood, in 1989, that was not something you did to a man like this without consequences. The producer watched Seagal walk back into the room. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look concerned. He looked satisfied. And that's when Seagal understood something that changed the whole shape of the evening. The two men in the restroom were not the plan. They were the setup. The real trap was what came after. Do you believe her now? He thought about it. Really thought about it. I think I'm starting to. I reached into my hoodie pocket. I had a pen. Don't ask me why. I always carried a pen back then. Habit from signing autographs in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. I took a napkin from my pocket. Wrinkled. From the bar. I wrote a name on it. A phone number. A man I knew in Newark who ran a program for young men trying to get back on their feet. Education. Job placement. The whole thing. He owed me a favor. Actually, he owed me about 12 favors. I handed the napkin to Marcus. Call this number tomorrow. Tell him Mike sent you. He'll take care of the rest. Marcus looked at the napkin. He held it with both hands, like it was the most important thing anyone had ever given him. And maybe it was. He folded it carefully, twice. Then he put it in his front pocket. Not his back pocket. His front. Where he could feel it. Where it wouldn't fall out. Where it was safe. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. And that's the question, isn't it? Why would a man who had lost everything, his title, his reputation, his peace, why would that man sit in a bar and risk everything he had left for a kid he didn't know? I'll tell you why. Because when I was that kid, somebody did it for me. 'Cause walked into a juvenile detention center and saw a 14-year-old boy that the world had already given up on. He saw a kid who had been arrested over 30 times before his 13th birthday. A kid who couldn't read, who fought everyone, who trusted no one. And he didn't walk out. He stayed. He sat down. And he said, "I think you could be the heavyweight champion of the world." And that sentence, those 12 words, they saved my life. I wasn't going to pretend to be. I was broken in ways that old man never was. I had made mistakes that would have made him ashamed. But I could do one thing he did. I could stay. I could sit down. I could look at a kid who the world had already written off and say, "You're worth something." That's what I did that night. Not with a punch. Not with fame. Not with anything the world thinks makes Mike Tyson who he is. I did it with a napkin, pen, and a phone number. Marcus and I sat on that bench until the sky started turning gray. He told me about his mother, about her illness, about how he brought her soup every Tuesday and read to her from the newspaper because her eyes were getting bad. He told me about the apartment above the laundromat, about the dishes he washed every night, about the math problems he still solved in his head when the restaurant was slow. He told me everything, and I listened, because sometimes that's the fight. Sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is not throw the punch. Not become the monster. Not give the world the version of you they already decided you are. Sometimes the fight is sitting on a cold bench at 4 in the morning and listening to a kid who just needs someone to hear him. I walked Marcus home that night, all the way to the laundromat, 12 blocks. We didn't talk much on the way. We didn't need to. Some things get said without words. He walked a little taller than he did when we left the bar. His shoulders were back. His head was up. Small changes. But I noticed them, because I remembered the first time I walked like that. The first time I felt like the ground under my feet was mine to stand on. He went upstairs. I stood on the sidewalk and waited until I saw the light go on in his window. A small yellow square in the middle of a dark building. Then I turned around and walked back to my apartment. The streets were empty. The sun was coming up. The ocean was still doing its thing. And I thought about what Kaz used to say. Every man carries a war inside him. The question isn't whether you fight. The question is who you fight for. That night, for the first time in a long time, I fought for the right person. I fought for someone who couldn't fight for himself. And I did it without ever throwing a single punch. The producer stood up from his table, straightened his tie, and walked directly toward Seagal, smiling, relaxed, like they were old friends. "Steven, great party, isn't it? Can I get you a drink?" Seagal looked at him, and in that look you could see the calculation happening. Not anger, not fear, calculation. Because Seagal had been in situations like this before. Not in Hollywood, in Japan, where powerful men didn't use fists either. They used obligation, reputation, leverage, and the only way to survive was to be 3 moves ahead. "I don't drink," Seagal said. "Of course. Water, then." The producer signaled a waiter, still smiling, still calm. Then he leaned in and said something that most people in the room wouldn't have heard. "I hope you enjoyed your trip to the restroom. I hear the facilities can be unpredictable." There it was. The confirmation. He wasn't hiding it. He wanted Seagal to know. Wanted him to feel the walls closing in. Because a man who knows he's trapped is a man who makes mistakes. That's the theory anyway. A studio executive, one of the men who had been pitching Seagal earlier, appeared at his side, took his arm, guided him away from the producer with a polite excuse about needing to discuss scheduling. Once they were out of earshot, the executive's tone changed completely. "Listen to me. That man has ended careers before. Not with anything you can prove. Just phone calls. Quiet ones. You'll stop getting scripts. Your agent will stop returning calls. The press will suddenly have stories about you that never happened. And by the time you figure out what's going on, it's too late. Seagal listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. The executive continued. Whatever happened in that hallway tonight, it didn't happen. You understand? You were here the whole time. You never left the room. That's the story. Seagal looked at the executive for a long moment. Then he looked across the room at the producer, who was now standing by the bar, phone pressed to his ear, watching Seagal with a smile that hadn't changed once. No, Seagal said. That's not the story. The executive blinked. Stephen, you don't understand how this works. I understand exactly how this works, Seagal said. That's why I'm not going to run from it. He thanked the executive, patted him on the shoulder, and started walking toward the producer's table. Now believe me when I tell you, every person in this story up to this point had underestimated Steven Seagal. The two men in the restroom thought he was an actor. The producer thought he was a target. The studio executive thought he was naive. And every single one of them was wrong. Because the man walking across that room right now wasn't an actor playing a tough guy. He was a man who had spent 15 years in a country where you learn to see the whole board. Not just the next move. The whole board. And he had seen this board before the first piece was even placed. Seagal pulled out a chair at the producer's table and sat down. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for an invitation. He just sat. The way a man sits when he owns the next 5 minutes of your life and you don't know it yet. The table went quiet. There were 3 other people sitting there. 2 women and a man in a gray suit. None of them spoke. They could feel it. That shift in the air when something is about to happen and you don't want to be in the middle of it. One of the women quietly picked up her clutch and excused herself. The man in the gray suit followed. The second woman stayed. She looked like she'd seen moments like this before. The producer didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair and smiled. That same smile. The one that hadn't changed all night. Stephen, I'm glad you came over. I think we have a lot to talk about. We do, Seagal said. The producer began talking. And believe me, it was rehearsed. Every word of it. He talked about how Hollywood works. About how some men rise fast and fall faster. About how the smart ones build relationships. Make alliances. Learn who to say yes to. He talked about the project Seagal had turned down 6 months ago. About how that refusal had embarrassed him in front of people who don't forget embarrassment. He talked about the 2 men. Not directly, but with enough implication that the message was clear. Tonight was a preview. A taste. Things could get much worse. He finished by placing both hands flat on the table and leaning forward. So, what do you want to do about this? Seagal reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The producer's eyes tracked the movement. For half a second, something flickered behind that smile. Not fear exactly, but attention. The kind of attention you give a man when you're not sure what he's reaching for. What Seagal pulled out was small, black, rectangular, a cassette recorder, the kind that fit in a coat pocket, the kind that journalists used, the kind that lawyers used. He placed it on the table between them and pressed play. The sound quality wasn't perfect. There was an echo, the hiss of a room with marble walls. But the voices were clear. 2 men, talking before the confrontation, laughing. One of them said the producer's name, said it plainly. The other one described the job. Corner him, scare him, rough him up if he doesn't cooperate. Make sure he understands who he's dealing with. They were laughing about it, talking about how easy it would be, how actors are soft, how this guy probably couldn't throw a real punch if his life depended on it. The recording played for about 30 seconds. That's all it took. Now get this. The producer's face. I wish you could have seen it. The smile didn't just disappear. Collapsed. Like a building losing its foundation floor by floor. His jaw tightened. His hands, still flat on the table, curled slightly at the edges. The woman still sitting at the table looked at the recorder and then looked at the producer and then looked away, like she just witnessed something she wanted no part of. Seagal pressed stop. The room wasn't loud, but it wasn't quiet either. There was music, conversation, laughter from the bar. Nobody else at the party knew what was happening at this table. But at this table, the world had just turned upside down. Seagal spoke calmly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean in. He said something like this. I recorded that when they first walked into the restroom. Before they touched me. They named you. They described the job. They were detailed. If this tape reaches the right journalist, your name is the headline. If it reaches the police, the charges won't be against me. And if it reaches the studio heads you do business with, you won't get a meeting in this town for the rest of your life. The producer opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. We can work something out, he said. His voice was different now, smaller. The rehearsed speech was gone. We're not working anything out, Seagal said. I don't negotiate. Here's what happens. You leave this party tonight. You don't call me. You don't send anyone to talk to me. You don't mention my name in any room. And this tape goes into a drawer and stays there. That's the only offer. The producer stared at him. 10 seconds. Maybe 15. The longest 15 seconds of his evening. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, picked up his phone from the table, and walked out of the party without saying a word to anyone. Not to the women at his table. Not to the bartender. Not to the host. He just left. Seagal watched him go. Then he picked up the cassette recorder, slid it back into his jacket pocket, and signaled the waiter. Water, please. Now if you've been with me this far, and I hope you have, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this one don't come around every day. And I promise you, the ones coming next are even better. The waiter brought the water. Seagal took a sip, set it down, and for the first time that evening, he looked like a man who had nothing left to prove.